There are certain things that a narcissist will never admit frighten them because admitting fear at all would threaten the exact image they've spent a lifetime constructing. But underneath the confidence, the charm, and the constant need for control, there are specific things that genuinely terrify them, things that go far deeper than simple discomfort. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what these 7 things are, why they hit so much harder than ordinary conflict, and why narcissists will do almost anything to avoid facing them. If you've ever wondered what actually goes on behind that unshakable exterior, comment number 4 once you get there, because that's the one most people don't expect. Before we get into the list, it helps to understand something important about how narcissists experience fear differently than most people. For someone with a healthy, stable sense of self, fear is usually tied to real external threats: loss, danger, failure, rejection. But for a narcissist, fear is almost always tied to something much more internal. It's tied to exposure. It's tied to the possibility that the carefully constructed image they present to the world might not hold up under close examination. This is why the things that terrify them most aren't always the things you'd expect. Of everything on this list, being ignored may be the single most destabilizing experience a narcissist can face. Not because ignoring them causes them pain in the way it might cause pain to someone else. It terrifies them because it removes the one resource they depend on most: attention. Whether that attention comes in the form of admiration, jealousy, anger, or even pity, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it confirms their relevance, and being ignored strips that confirmation away entirely. This is why narcissists often escalate when they sense someone withdrawing attention from them. A partner who goes quiet, a friend who stops responding as quickly, a family member who stops engaging with the same intensity they once did. To an outside observer, this withdrawal might look like nothing more than someone setting a healthy boundary. To the narcissist, it can feel like a kind of erasure, a direct threat to their sense of existing meaningfully in someone else's world. Being ignored doesn't just wound their ego, it forces them to sit with a version of themselves that isn't being reflected back through someone else's engagement, and for many narcissists, that silence is unbearable. This is also why the early stages of no contact tend to produce such disproportionate reactions. A narcissist who barely acknowledged someone's presence for months can suddenly become fixated the moment that person stops responding altogether. It's rarely about missing the individual specifically. It's about the sudden absence of a mirror they didn't realize they were relying on until it was gone. Some respond by testing the silence with small, low-stakes messages. Others go quiet themselves, hoping mutual silence will force the other person to break first. Underneath both responses is the same discomfort, the unfamiliar experience of not knowing whether they still matter to someone they assumed would always keep them in view. Narcissists spend enormous amounts of energy managing how they're perceived. Every interaction is, on some level, a performance calibrated to produce admiration, sympathy, or respect. What terrifies them is the possibility that someone might see past that performance entirely, someone who recognizes the manipulation, the inconsistencies, the gap between the image they project and who they actually are underneath it. This fear explains why narcissists often react so strongly to anyone who calls out their behavior calmly and specifically, rather than reacting emotionally. An emotional reaction can be managed, dismissed, or turned around on the other person. Calm, accurate observation is much harder to deflect because it doesn't give them anything to argue against. It simply states what's true, and truth, when it threatens the image they've built, becomes something to fear rather than something to face. Being seen clearly threatens the entire foundation their self-image rests on. which is why they often go to great lengths to avoid people who seem capable of seeing through them. Interestingly, this fear often produces a very specific pattern of avoidance. Narcissists will frequently gravitate away from people who ask quiet, pointed questions, the kind that don't accuse, but simply invite reflection. Questions like, "Why did you say it that way?" or "What did you mean by that?" tend to unsettle them far more than direct confrontation, because there's no obvious way to perform their way out of a question that simply waits for an honest answer. Over time, they often learn to identify and quietly distance themselves from anyone who consistently asks these kinds of questions, not because that person has done anything wrong, but because that person has demonstrated an unwelcome ability to see past the performance. Control is central to how narcissists maintain their sense of security, and nowhere is that more true than in how a story gets told. Whether it's the story of a relationship ending, a conflict at work, or a falling out within a family, narcissists work hard to ensure they remain the author of that story, even if that means rewriting details, minimizing their own role, or casting themselves as the victim of circumstances they actually created. What terrifies them is the possibility that someone else might tell a different version, one that doesn't protect them, one that includes details they'd rather keep hidden. This is why narcissists often respond with intense anxiety or aggression when they sense they're losing control over how others perceive a situation. It's rarely about the specific facts being discussed. It's about who gets to decide what those facts mean. Losing control of the narrative means losing control of how they're seen, and for someone whose entire identity depends on managing perception, that loss can feel almost existential. This is part of why narcissists often move quickly to share their version of events after a conflict or breakup, sometimes before the other person has even had time to process what happened. Speed matters here, because whoever tells the story first often shapes how it gets received by everyone else. A narcissist who senses they're losing that head start will often become visibly anxious, reaching out to mutual friends, family members, or even coworkers in an effort to plant their version before an alternative narrative can take hold. This urgency isn't about clearing up misunderstanding, it's about damage control, executed before the damage has even had a chance to fully surface. This is the one many people don't expect, because narcissists often appear to apologize fairly easily, at least on the surface. But there's an important difference between a performative apology offered to end conflict or regain access to someone, and genuine accountability, which requires actually sitting with the impact of their behavior without deflecting, minimizing, or redirecting blame elsewhere. Genuine accountability terrifies narcissists because it requires something they've spent years avoiding: a direct confrontation with the gap between who they believe themselves to be and how their actions have actually affected other people. Most narcissists have built elaborate defense systems specifically designed to prevent this kind of confrontation from ever fully landing. Blame shifting, minimizing, playing the victim, all of these serve the same underlying purpose: protecting them from having to sit with the discomfort of true responsibility. This is why real accountability, the kind that doesn't offer an exit ramp, tends to trigger some of the strongest defensive reactions. It's not that they can't understand what they did, it's that fully absorbing it would require dismantling a self-image they've spent a lifetime protecting. You can often tell the difference between a performative apology and genuine accountability by what happens immediately afterward. A performative apology is usually followed by an expectation, sometimes spoken, sometimes not, that the matter is now closed and the relationship should return to normal. Genuine accountability, by contrast, doesn't come with that expectation attached. It simply sits with the discomfort without immediately asking for relief from it. This is precisely why it's so rare among narcissists. Sitting with discomfort without using it as leverage to regain access or sympathy requires a kind of emotional endurance that runs directly against how they've learned to survive conflict their entire lives. Narcissists often rely on keeping the people in their life somewhat separated from each other, at least in terms of information. Different versions of events get told to different people. Different explanations get offered depending on who's asking. This isn't always a conscious strategy, but it functions as one regardless, because it prevents any single person from having the full picture. What terrifies them is the possibility that people might start comparing notes, that the version told to a friend might contradict the version told to a family member, that patterns which look isolated in individual relationships might suddenly become obvious once multiple people start talking to each other. This is often referred to as triangulation working in reverse, and it can be one of the most disorienting experiences for a narcissist because it removes their ability to control information flow entirely. Once people start comparing notes, inconsistencies that were easy to explain away individually become much harder to justify collectively, and that shift can feel like the walls closing in from every direction at once. This is why narcissists often react with unusual intensity to friend groups or families becoming closer, more communicative, or more aligned than they were before. What looks like ordinary social bonding to everyone else can feel, to the narcissist, like a slow erosion of the information silos they've relied on for years. In some cases, they'll attempt to insert themselves into these growing connections specifically to monitor and manage what's being said. In others, they'll try to create new divisions, subtle conflicts, or misunderstandings designed to keep people just distant enough from each other that full comparison never quite happens. Most people, when a relationship becomes difficult, go through a period of trying to fix things before they walk away. They explain, they negotiate, they hope things will improve. Narcissists have often become so used to this pattern that they mistake it for guaranteed loyalty, assuming that as long as someone is still trying, they haven't truly lost them yet. What terrifies them is someone who skips that entire process, someone who simply leaves without the extended negotiation phase they've come to expect. This kind of departure doesn't give them the usual warning signs. There's no escalating conflict to manage, no ultimatum to charm their way around, no visible unraveling they can respond to before it's too late. There's simply absence, arriving with a finality they never saw coming because they were never given the chance to intervene. This type of leaving is often the hardest for a narcissist to process, precisely because it denies them the opportunity to perform the changes, apologies, or promises that have worked in the past. By the time they realize what's happened, there's nothing left to negotiate. What makes this especially disorienting is that it removes the entire feedback loop they've relied on to gauge how much room they have to misbehave. In their experience, conflict has always come with warning signs, escalating frustration, repeated conversations, visible unhappiness, all of which gave them time to course correct, just enough to keep the relationship intact. Someone who leaves without any of those warning signs first has effectively been processing and deciding for a long time before the narcissist ever noticed anything was wrong. That gap between when the decision was actually made internally and when it finally becomes visible is often what makes this kind of departure feel so abrupt and so impossible to reverse. At the deepest level, everything on this list connects back to one core fear, the fear of becoming irrelevant, not disliked, not even hated, simply irrelevant, forgotten, no longer factored into someone else's life or thoughts in any meaningful way. For most people, being disliked is uncomfortable but survivable. For a narcissist, irrelevance can feel like a kind of erasure because so much of their identity depends on continuing to exist within other people's attention. This is why narcissists often prefer negative attention to no attention at all. Anger, conflict, even hatred all confirm that they still matter enough to provoke a reaction. Irrelevance offers no such confirmation. It simply moves on without them, And that quiet, ongoing indifference tends to be far more threatening than any confrontation could ever be. This fear of irrelevance often intensifies with time rather than fading. Early on, a narcissist might convince themselves that the people who've distanced from them will eventually circle back, that their absence is temporary, that their importance will reassert itself given enough patience. But as months turn into years, and life continues moving forward without them exactly as it would have with them, that comforting story becomes harder and harder to maintain. What remains underneath the image management and the new relationships and the carefully curated appearance of thriving is often a quiet, persistent awareness that somewhere in someone else's life, they've simply stopped being a factor at all. It's worth pausing here to address something important. None of these 7 fears exist in isolation. They tend to overlap and compound each other, which is part of why certain situations, a public falling out, a group of people comparing stories, a former partner visibly thriving without them, can feel so intensely threatening all at once. When several of these fears activate simultaneously, narcissists often respond with a level of anger, desperation, or manipulation that seems disproportionate to the actual situation. Understanding this can help make sense of reactions that otherwise feel confusing or extreme, reactions that have far less to do with you than they do with the internal structure being threatened all at once. It also helps to recognize that none of these fears require you to do anything dramatic in order to activate them. You don't need to expose them publicly, gather allies against them, or engineer some elaborate confrontation. Simply living your life with clarity, consistency, and healthy boundaries tends to touch on several of these fears naturally, without any deliberate effort on your part. This is often why people who've distanced themselves from a narcissist notice unexpected reactions months or even years later, triggered by nothing more than the narcissist noticing, in some small way, that life has continued on without them. Understanding these fears isn't about using them as weapons or trying to punish someone for behavior that caused you pain. It's about recognizing that the calm, steady boundaries you've been setting, the distance you've created, the silence you've maintained, all of it may be having a far greater impact than you realize, even if you never see direct evidence of it. You don't need their fear to validate your healing. You don't need to know exactly how unsettled they've become to know that you made the right choice in protecting your peace. What matters most is that you're no longer organizing your life around managing their comfort, their image, or their need for control. And that shift, quiet as it may look from the outside, is often the very thing they fear the most. It's also worth remembering that fear in this context is not the same thing as change. A narcissist confronting one or more of these fears may become momentarily more cautious, more attentive, even more apologetic, but that response is rarely evidence of genuine growth. More often, it's a temporary reaction to discomfort aimed at restoring the exact dynamic that made them comfortable in the first place. Recognizing this distinction matters because it protects you from mistaking a fear response for real transformation and from allowing a moment of apparent vulnerability to pull you back into a pattern you've already worked hard to step away from. The real value in understanding what terrifies a narcissist isn't found in using that knowledge against them. It's found in recognizing how much power you actually have simply by living authentically, setting boundaries, and refusing to shrink yourself to manage someone else's comfort. Every one of these 7 fears is ultimately rooted in a loss of control over you specifically, control over your attention, your loyalty, your silence, your forgiveness. The more fully you reclaim those things for yourself, the less power any of these fears have to pull you back into an old dynamic that no longer serves you. If this helped you understand something you've experienced firsthand, let me know in the comments, and subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this one.